Hi, and welcome back. So today I've got just a real basic video about different types of irrigation, specifically called out by the College Board for the AP Environmental Science exam. And I set it up where there's a slide with just a basic description of the type of irrigation, some benefits, some drawbacks. So I think there's four different types that I'll review here. And it makes sense that they called this out as important because globally, the majority of water humans use on Earth, is to irrigate crops. I think it's 70% of the water we use is for irrigation globally. So it makes sense. So the first type, it's called flood irrigation, and it's just like it sounds. You flood the field with water. So not much else to say about it. But it basically involves flooding the agricultural field with water, covering it in water. I think rice paddies, maybe come to mind when you think of this. A lot of developing countries, this would be their main type of irrigation. So water is usually coming from a nearby river or maybe a canal. It takes a lot of water, obviously, to flood a field. So you need a pretty good water source to do that. So this is a picture I thought maybe that might even be familiar to some of you. So there's a canal down at the bottom of the picture, and you can see they just take it from there to put on the agricultural field. The benefits, inexpensive, right? Just have to, you can use a, can't think, you could use a pump that requires energy or electricity or fossil fuels. But you could also use gravity and other things to get the water going. So it often requires little to no technology. And it is the main type of irrigation used in less developed countries, but it is used here in the United States, and other highly developed countries may use this technique as well, as it is inexpensive. The drawbacks, a lot of the water that you flood onto the field, I don't know if that's the best English, but a lot of the water that you put onto the field, it actually evaporates, right? The sun hits it, warms up, and it evaporates before it even percolates into the soil or is taken up by plants. It can lead to waterlogging and salinization. At the end of this PowerPoint, I've got some pictures of waterlogging and salinization, so I'll say more about that then. Also, if the runoff is not captured and treated, so you flood the field with water, as it moves through the soil or moves along through the field, it would pick up any fertilizer, it could pick up any pesticides, anything that's on the land, and then it could carry it down to maybe another river, or it could percolate down into groundwater, contaminating it. So that's also a problem. The next one is furrow irrigation, and really this is a type of flood irrigation, basically. So flood irrigation is basically flood irrigation. It's the same concept. You're just flooding the field, except in furrow irrigation, you've actually dug these kind of little mini canals, or what they call furrows. So these are right here. That's a furrow. You've actually dug these, like it says, little canals in between your rows of crops. And so when you put the water on the field, you're technically flooding it, but you're flooding it along these little canals. So you dig deep furrows in between each row of crops, fill it with water. And again, usually this comes from a nearby river or canal. It takes a lot of water, but technically it could come from groundwater if you're in a situation where that's available. So here in the valley, that's, could be the case. Some more pictures. And again, you can see here we just got a big pipe with water in it. And I would suspect gravity, maybe here it's a little bit lower point. Up here it's a little bit higher, right? So they're just using that, and the water's going to flow that way. Same deal here. They get a little bit of water flowing in this little tube, and it's just going to move that way from the canal. Again, it's inexpensive, requires little to no technology. So again, this is something very commonly used in less developed countries, but it's used here as well. The drawbacks are the same as flood irrigation. Much of the water is evaporated or is lost to evaporation or run off into a nearby stream. It could carry contaminants into those nearby streams or down into groundwater. And as at the end of the video here, I have something about waterlogging and salinization. So flood irrigation is when you completely flood the land. This furrow irrigation is a type of flooding, but it's a little more specific. You have these little canals that you've dug. but really the same kind of concept. All right, spray irrigation. This is one you're definitely familiar with. Just think sprinklers, right? So you're spraying water onto the crops. So I thought this was a good picture because you're all familiar with these, right? You've seen them at school or maybe at your home. So spray irrigation just involves, on the APES standards, they said it involves pumping groundwater. I think here in the valley, it may not always be groundwater, but nonetheless, they said it involves pumping groundwater into spray nozzles across an agricultural field. So it's just using sprinklers, basically. I wanted to put this picture because I thought these are things you're familiar with. You've all seen sprinklers like this, right? Spraying the crops, but these two down here, if you've been to Fresno State, kind of on the backside, these are out there often, or if you've just been out, to Sanger, some of those other places nearby, you've seen these. So it's a big, tall structure like this that can be moved, so the wheels here, and there's sprinklers. It's like spraying here. It can even spray from the top. It's just a giant, like, sprinkler spraying rig, sprays water. The benefit, it is more efficient. You're not using quite as much water because you're not flooding the land, and you wouldn't lose water really as much to evaporation, right? When the water is flooded onto the land, it can evaporate more easily. Here, it's kind of in these tubes that then push it through the sprinkler. So there's a little less water used and also less water kind of sitting on the top of the land. So you use less, lose less to evaporation. It's a little bit better that way. The drawbacks, it's more expensive than flooding or furrow irrigation. You need technology, right? You need machinery, and it does require some fossil fuels, some energy to run. You have to have something, actually pushing the water out of the sprinkler, something pumping it up to that system. So it would be a little more expensive to use. I think this is the last one, drip irrigation. And this one you may be familiar with if you've ever gardened, you may use drip irrigation. But basically, you have tubes, and perforating means they have little holes. So they have little holes in the hoses, and they release small amounts of water to the plants. Sometimes the tubes are even just kind of the perforations are very small. You can't even really see them. But you've got this tube here, right across here. There's little holes in it that the water can drip out of right onto your plant. So drip irrigation because it's dripping water onto your plant, I guess. Here's some kind of bigger scale pictures. You can see the tube going all the way down, right? And at each little plant, there's a little hole or perforation that can drip water onto the plant. This is the most efficient, at least compared to the others that I've discussed, but it's the most efficient. If you think about it, that makes sense. It's just dripping water right on the plant, just what it needs, and there's no water all on the land, so you're not going to get that runoff or that evaporation. So it would even protect nearby streams and groundwater from runoff, I would suspect, as well, because you don't have this huge amount of water picking up fertilizers and pesticides. It's all within the tube. So it would definitely be better for the environment in that respect too. The drawbacks, expensive. And that would keep a lot of farmers, they're trying to minimize cost, that would keep them from using drip irrigation. It's kind of been in California, as water has gotten more expensive, some farmers are maybe starting to find like, well, saving water can save us money, and they may start using these kinds of systems. But at this point, it is expensive, so it's less likely to happen. It would require more, also technology, more equipment, things like that. All right. Well, if you remember when I talked about flood and furrow irrigation, which is technically the same thing, you're just flooding the land, I brought up this waterlogging and salinization. These are two big problems, salinization particularly in the valley. But these are problems caused by that flooding of the land with irrigation water, kind of over irrigating. So I don't know that the land always looks like this, but I thought this would trigger something in your mind. If you think of like the soccer field when they use the sprinklers too much, you get this kind of soggy, you can kind of really see it here, right? It's kind of soggy. You can see the water hasn't really sunk in, even up here. You can see the water hasn't really sunk in. So whenever they water the grass at school, they always overdo it. And You think, oh, I can walk on it, and you do, and it's muddy and like a sloshy. That's like over irrigation. They've over irrigated the land. There's more water than can be absorbed. So some causes of waterlogging are basically over irrigation. You're over watering, but kind of also as a part of that, poor drainage. So the soil doesn't drain very well. If you think back to our labs with soil, right? We put your soil in a tube and we poured water in. If you remember, some of your soil didn't drain very well. The water didn't permeate through it very well, kind of blocked the path of the water. So if you are over irrigating and your soil doesn't drain very well, well, now you have soil that's like super saturated. It's what we call waterlogged. Here in the valley, we do also have a problem with some clay. If you remember, we looked at our soil. So if you look at this picture, it's from your textbook, actually. They've got this barrier down here of clay, and the water can't get through that clay. So they irrigate the land, right? Water kind of starts to percolate down, and it hits that clay layer and it backs up. And so it starts filling up this here, and it starts filling up all the pore spaces in the soil. It may be so overloaded with water, then that water starts to build up at the top. So if you think of that, the soil labs where we had that occur, you can kind of picture that. So it's a combination, really, over irrigation, the soil doesn't drain very well. There may even be a clay layer blocking the water from draining. So the soil becomes very oversaturated with water. Problems with that, oh, actually nice picture, forgot. The problems with that, if these were like empty air spaces, the pore spaces, well, if they become filled with water, the roots now have a few problems. So this is an example, this picture here, this would be waterlogged soil, right? So the air spaces become so full and saturated with water that the roots are completely covered in water. You have a few problems. You may have even done this before with a potted plant, but the roots can get moldy, can encourage mold to grow. Some bacteria like to grow in this kind of environment, and that can be problems. But the main thing, it keeps oxygen out, and plant roots need oxygen. So I put a little summary here that root cells need oxygen. Root cells are like any cells, like our cells. Our cells need oxygen, and they need oxygen to get energy out of the glucose, right? And humans, we eat food that has glucose in it. We breathe in oxygen, and there's a reaction called cellular respiration. It occurs in the mitochondria of our cells, and that's how we get energy out of the glucose we eat. Well, the same is true for root cells. Root cells have glucose, right, through photosynthesis. They've captured glucose. They also need to take in oxygen so this respiration can happen. And then they can get the energy back out of the glucose that they captured. It happens in their mitochondria as well. So if there is not oxygen, they can't efficiently get energy out of the glucose that they have. And if you can't get energy out of glucose, your cells are in trouble. They can't get the energy they need to do the kinds of things they need to do. And for instance, one of the things root cells need to do, they need to pull in nutrients from the soil. So the plant can't pull in the nutrients it needs. So it leads to the unavailability, I guess you could say, of energy for these root cells. And that will cause, before some other things may happen, but eventually maybe death. I also said waterlogged soil creates an environment for bacteria. So there's some bacteria that do not need oxygen. It's called anaerobic. And when those bacteria get energy out of the food they consume, if they do it without oxygen, they do give off some harmful gases, such as methane and some other things that then could be in the soil, could be in the water, could get into the atmosphere. Methane's a greenhouse gas that traps heat. So that could create some problems as well. Lastly, I put waterlogged soil can lead to soil salinization. And we did the whole salinization lab. We've talked about this. If the irrigation water has high levels of salt, which is the case here in the valley, and there's different types of salt. It's not necessarily like table salt, but if the water that you're irrigating your crops with has high levels of salt, and then it's left on the surface of a field, it's just sitting on top because it's waterlogged, so now the water is sitting on top of the fields, on top of the soil. The sun hits it, that water evaporates, well, then it leaves behind the salts that were in the water. over decades of irrigation, the salt builds up on the land, and most of the time salt is toxic for plants. So we had done our salinization lab with the mung beans. Kind of remember the effect of salt. Yeah. I don't know if this is a great picture, but I thought it kind of helped a little. So when irrigation water evaporates, the salts are left behind, right? So the salts get left behind. And so the salt concentrations eventually increase to levels that are toxic. It usually happens in soils that are often even waterlogged, and that's what keeps the water up top. Picture from your textbook of like a crusty salt on the surface of the soil. So you could see it's kind of a white, chalky kind of salt on top of the soil. So it's not just little amounts, it's a lot. This was from the textbook, and they talked about ways to prevent. Obviously, drip irrigation would be a way to prevent waterlogging and soil salinization. Some farmers here in the valley are actually trying to grow crops that can tolerate the salt. In the valley, some farmers have actually stopped growing crops on some of their land. They call it fallow, F-A-L-L-O-W. They're just leaving their land until they can figure out what to do. You can flush the soil, like you can pump a bunch of water onto the soil and then drain it. So this picture is trying to illustrate it here. They've got these tubes in the ground with little holes in them, and then they would have a pump that would pump it to a basin where they could figure out what to do with it. And so they pour a bunch of water on top, pour a bunch of water on here. It would carry the salt downward into these tubes, and then they could flush that out. It's just incredibly expensive. And that's kind of flush with installed drainage systems. Definitely check out the videos I linked. They're in the playlist Unit 5, Water Resources and Irrigation. I found a really good one on types of irrigation. I found a good one on how canals work. So definitely check it out. Have a great day.